Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
So, you may be wondering what all that was about. Well, I have to say, as I mentioned in my previous very long video about Halloween being my favorite time, pretty much all my videos from now until early November are going to have some mention of Halloween. A season for me that starts pretty much at the end of September. And goes well into November, even though most people don't necessarily see it that way. But the official arrival for me of the Halloween season, even though I'm celebrating it way before that, is on the day in October, generally somewhere around the 7th or 8th or 9th of October, that the cable TV music station called Sound of the Seasons begins to play Halloween music. I talked about this channel before on cable, and every year I look up to see the date that they start to feature the Halloween music, and that day was today. And I'm always excited when it comes on. I turn the channel on hours before. It switches over from music from Oktoberfest, so a lot of those German Oompa beer drinking songs, to Halloween music. which it generally only keeps up until November 1st, and then it switches over to Christmas music, which is way too early because that's like almost 2 months before Christmas. But Halloween is the one where I keep the channel turned on, and the day that this cable TV radio station starts to play the October Sounds of the Seasons Halloween is, to me, that's the official start of the season. So forgive the very crudely recorded way in which I did that. I have a DVR, and I actually record the channel on there, and I usually keep hours and hours of Halloween music on my DVR from the previous year, but I don't really know how to get that video into my computer so I can edit it, so I can put up a song in fairly decent definition. So all I am able to do is hold up my little iPad, my mini iPad, and as you see, film my TV with obviously, horrible sound coming out of it, and just to give you the sense of what's going on in that station for those of you who don't get it or can't see it for whatever reason. So I just waited until a song that I liked came on, one that really typifies the season, instead of the 10,000th time that they play Michael Jackson's Thriller or something like that. So here I am in the garage once again. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, and again I can't sleep. I tried. Laid there, fall asleep for maybe a half hour, and then wake up. Wake up like most people would wake up at 8 or 9 in the morning, just wide awake, like ready to start my day. So, I could fight it, but I know I'm just way too wide awake. So again, I'm being a little quieter than I normally would be, because I do have neighbors upstairs that are sleeping. So I'm gonna show you. This one won't be an hour and a half this time. I'm gonna show what's playing in the background, and hopefully you can hear it a little bit. The one CD that I spoke about that I forgot to include in my last video, that to me is one of those rare albums that has an association with Halloween to me, yet the theme of the music in the album has nothing to do with Halloween or ghosts or anything, and it's Manuel Gotchings, also known as the leader of Ashra Temple, an all-solo album of his from 1977. Didn't come out till the 90s, till the late 90s, called Dreams and Desire. And this track on here is called Desire, but to me, it's The Ghost. To what extent you can hear it, there's this little trill thing going on throughout the entire piece for 23 minutes. That sounds like a ghost, it sounds like a haunted ghost, and this little thing plays throughout the entire piece, and it sounds like a ghost swinging, like from tree to tree or something like that, and having a ball. And I thought that probably from the very first time I played the track off of the album. And as a result, it joins that really, really tiny group of albums that I have that really have nothing to do with Halloween. None of the titles have anything to do with Halloween or ghosts or anything supernatural. Like Tangerine Dream's Green Desert, same thing. And yet, simply because of something in the music itself, or the time of year that I really heavily got into playing it, in this case, it's that ghost sound that you may be able to hear just below my talking. That little ghost sound in that piece is the one that did it to me, and this has become a Halloween CD. I also received VCLT from Jeff, our buddy Jeff, and I'm going to show those. One of those fits in real well, and he knows what a fan I am anyway, of Halloween, and this is something called Dracula's Music Cabinet, which is The Vampires of Dartmoor. This is, how do you describe it? It's German, it's the work of primarily a German musician who paired up with a guy who is a more traditional type of songwriter, another German songwriter. And I had heard of this guy before as a supporting musician to guys like Volker Kriegel and people like that. And what they did in the, I guess this was around 1970, and this was an album that came out on vinyl that didn't do too well and kind of disappeared. And this label, this European label that's into re-releasing old obscure albums, decided to put it out again. And what it's made to sound like is a soundtrack to a psychedelic late 60s low budget horror movie. And you would have to, I'm majorly into this, so this really hit a note with me. If you were the kind of person like me that's into European horror movies, low budget, from specific directors whose names you probably wouldn't know, out of the late 60s, these kind of independent guys that made a lot of horror movies kind of did this combination of kind of like R-rated, sexy, a lot of vampire movies and horror movies in general, and they kind of had a psychedelic feel to them, and a lot of them used jazz musicians in them, European jazz musicians, to create these soundtracks that were kind of psychedelic and jazzy. And some of these soundtracks did come out, were released as records, even though the films themselves were never commercial hits or anything. And these two guys that decided to make this music kind of tried to create a fake soundtrack. This is not actually a movie soundtrack, but they have some voices and screams in with the music. It's all very kitschy, all very tongue-in-cheek, but the music does sound very much, and I have a lot of these movies, so I know, trust me, it does sound very much like a late 60s, early 70s European movie, especially Spanish and German movies, horror movies that were psychedelic and mixing a lot of sex with vampires and things like that. And very much sounds like a soundtrack, even though this wasn't actually a soundtrack to any movie at all. But they have some voiceovers, oddly enough in English, speaking in English, that are every once in a while come in with the music. Very odd stuff. And, some screams and stuff like that. Very, very much tongue-in-cheek. Very kind of psychedelic, but there's a heavy jazz influence in there. Well, a lot of it's jazzy, but there's a lot of like an electric vibe to it too. Maybe like there'll be electric bass or an organ in with the music. Purposely sounds dated, even though it was made in the late 60s, early 70s. But they were definitely, I think, aware that the music would sound dated, in the future. So this was something I didn't know at all about this. This is Bull. It's only about 37 minutes, so it pretty much reflects the original vinyl album. This is one of those albums that if you were to go find this on vinyl, it would probably cost you a small fortune, because the original one did not sell very well. And I'm sure it only came out in Europe. So I played that today in keeping with the spirit of the season. Thank you, Jeff. And oddly enough, and this other one I'm going to show because Jeff sent it in the package, has nothing to do with Halloween. And yet, here's Jon Hassell. Now, probably most of the folks that watch my videos know trumpeter Jon Hassell, especially as I did first discover him through his association with Brian Eno when they did the Fourth World album, which I have on vinyl and on CD. I bought it as a new release, which is the thing that turned me on to Jon Hassell, which was, when was that? Very early 80s, or was it It was very late 70s. I think it was about 1980 that Fourth World album came out, which was about, I think that was about Jon Hassel's third solo album or so. And John's jumped around and bounced around to a lot of labels. Because I'm a fan of ECM Records, I did have his more recent ECM album, which I want to say I think it was from about 2009. But he's done a lot of recordings all over the place for different labels. And this is one that I have missed until Jeff brought it along to my attention. This actually came out in 2005. And it's kind of a weird history because most of the recording on here are from various live concerts that John recorded using numerous musicians. Then he went in the studio and re-recorded some parts and actually would take sections and instruments from one of the live performances and kind of cut it out of that live performance and I guess like overdub it into another live performance. Sounds kind of weird. I don't know how you would do that with the, with the keys being different, if they were different, the rhythms being different. But so he kind of assembled this thing. The original tracks were live performances, but then he did go in and do some new studio recording on top of those. And then the weird thing is he took sections and instruments from one live performance and threw them on top of one of the other live performances. So it's kind of weird. But again, I don't know how long the original live performances were, so he could have been taking sections from these live performances that don't appear on album here, because a lot of there's a bunch of 11-minute pieces on here, but this kind of music can usually go on for 30 or 40 minutes. So I don't know. They don't get into a lot of these specifics as to what was taken from where and kind of fused on top of what other piece on here. But there is a bit of the only thing on here that I would say sounds normal. So once you know Jon Hassel's music, you don't expect it to sound normal. It's got a dub feel to it. In the repetitive bass line, there's a bit of a dub feel. But apart from that, it's pretty dark stuff, and the dark in the sense of Jon Hassel. If you know his stuff, it's dark stuff in general. Very much sounds like it could be soundtrack music, definitely. And I enjoyed this. The funny thing is simply because Jeff had sent both of these CDs together, and I dumped both of them into my computer, and I was listening to the earlier CD, and I copied this Jon Hassel into the computer and put it as the next album to play when the other Dracula CD was done. And of course, these two musics have nothing in common with each other. And yet I was surprised at how kind of well it wasn't like this kind of like crashingly obvious switch when the Dracula music ended from that kind of jazzy, psychedelic, lounge, pseudo soundtrack music into the Jon Hassel. It didn't sound like a strange transition at all, oddly enough. And then it really dawned on me how much, not that the Jon Hassel stuff has that late 60s kitschy vibe to it, but the darkness of the Dracula, some of the Dracula music trying to attempt to sound soundtrack-ish, and the Jon Hassel music, it was weird. It was oddly compatible, in a way that I just never would think. This is a great one to have. And so that's it for CDs, actually, for the music. I wanted to show a few books that I always pull out for this time of year. I went on about 7 or 8 years ago. I have enough of a weight problem. I don't eat snacks and cakes and things like that. But for a while I got into do a little bit of baking. And my favorite thing to bake because my favorite time of year are Halloween treats. So I have several of these books of Halloween treats, and I enjoyed for a while making these. Like, I love that. Look at those cupcakes with the spider web design. I actually got into doing some of these things. And I bought a few of these books, which I keep, and someday I will get back to making these, and I just have to find somebody to give this stuff to, because I'm not going to eat it. But there's lots of cool recipes. Here's a better picture. I just love the way that looks. It's just so Halloweenish. And I have several of these cookbooks, and the funny thing is every year I do pick them out, and I'm like, I don't think I'm going to do any cooking this year, kind of thing. But see, marshmallows shaped like bones and ghosts, and they just walk you through how to make those, and it's just a trip. And someday, certainly when I am retired, I'll be doing baking like that, and finding neighbors or somebody to give those away to. I guess you can't really give them away to kids because they're not wrapped, so they would just get tossed. When I worked in an office, that'd be the perfect place for them, because you could just bring them into the office and people would ravage them there. There wouldn't be any left within an hour or two. So if I'm lucky enough to end up working in another office, then, you know, the situation when I get a job, I will get back to that maybe even before I am able to retire. And a couple books that I always pull out, and I actually always, for several years now since I've had them, read a little bit of every year at Halloween at very least. Sometimes I would make the attempt to read the whole thing, but they're a bit thick. But I got a couple books, both of short stories, fiction, and I don't actually read a lot of fiction. And this type, the short stories, Halloween-y kind of things, are pretty much the only fiction I would read. So here's one that I bought on sale at, I think this was at a Barnes & Noble, Tales of Terror. Alfred Hitchcock loaned his name to this. You can see it's a very thick book, very thick. And if you're aware of the history of Alfred Hitchcock's TV show that came out in the late 50s and early 60s, it was so outrageously popular that a lot of things sprung up from that, including a magazine that was a monthly magazine. It still prints today. It's not monthly, called Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. All short stories, written usually by fairly well-known authors of short stories. Not supernatural stuff, usually crime and mystery type of thing. And the Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, I believe, as last time I checked, it was still being printed. At one point, it was a very popular magazine that came out monthly, and I actually had a couple issues of it. The other thing that resulted from the magazine, and probably from other sources too, is an entire series, and I mean a series of 30 or 40 or more paperback books of short stories, most of which were actually taken from old issues of Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. Again, all short stories. A lot of times, it's a lot of it was like a pool of short story writers, because you began to recognize names. And these inexpensive paperbacks apparently were big hits, and they came out in the probably in the early 60s, after the show had established itself and was a big hit. But even after the show was canceled, they continued to come out. I don't believe any of them were ever published in hardcover. And back in the early 80s, when all of those paperbacks had pretty much gone out of print, the book company put them right back in print again. They changed the covers, but they were still very inexpensively priced paperbacks. They kept, as far as I'm aware, of all the content, or whatever the title of the book was. Alfred Hitchcock's Tales to Murder By, or Alfred Hitchcock's Tales of Mystery, whatever they titled each book. They kept them intact from the original printing from the 60s. So and I just got into this thing where I was just snatching them all up from the bookstore and reading them all. And they were even probably even more fun then than they ended up being in the when they were first released in the early 60s, because now the stories were very old. They were from the 50s, mostly the late 50s, 60 or 61. And so by the time 83 or so that I was heavily, 82, 83 in that time period, that I was heavily reading them, the stories very much had a flavor of the way things were written and the way life was like from the late 50s, early 60s, and obviously things had changed since then. But in a way, it made the stories even more interesting. It was like a look into the past and a look into the time period when these little collection anthologies of short stories were printed. I had all of those books, which were, because they were inexpensive paperbacks, they got kind of yellow over the years. Pages kind of dried out. I didn't bring them with me when I moved about 4 years ago, but at some point in my future, I'm going to see if they're in print again, or if they come in print again, I might pick them up. But I was very excited to find this, because this is the same thing. It's just not it's a hardcover, but it's not a hardcover version of 2 or 3 of these books, because the books weren't long. They were fairly short, small books. This one probably contains enough stories to fill maybe like 3 or more of those old paperback compilations. But I was kind of excited to see this, because they really never did a lot of printings of those short stories in a hardcover big book like this. And I don't know how many of these they've done. Probably not a lot. I wouldn't really think they would sell that well. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that any of the stories that are in here were ones that actually would have appeared in that original batch of 30 or 40, however many it was, books, because they come from a slightly later period. There are a few stories that date as far back as 1961, which is kind of the tail end of when the stories, the period of when the stories ended that were in the earlier paperback compilations. But a lot of the stories are here from the late 60s and actually go into the early to mid 70s. And for the most part, the stories did not run that late in the earlier set of those paperbacks, because the original paperbacks were printed before the late 60s initially. The early 60s and so most of the stories ran from the late 50s to the very, very early 60s in those original paperbacks. And when they reprinted them in the early 80s, they just reprinted the original books with the original stories as they were, so they were very old. So this one has stories going up to, there's a whole bunch from 68, 69, but they go up to like 1976, which is, they go back to I see a story from 1960 in here. Goes into the mid 70s, which from, most of you folks was an ancient time anyway, but to me that's a bit more of a modern era, and the writing would be a bit more, certainly a different style of writing, maybe a little more grit to it than the standard kind of mystery stories, which were very safe, that you had in the late 50s and early 60s. But the writers, there's a whole bunch of the writers' names that I do recognize on here all the same. Not most of them, but there's a handful that were the same writers that were writing the stories for the old Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazine in those early paperbacks. August Derleth is one of them, whose name, he probably had at least one story in every single one of those old books. Robert Bloch is in here. So some fairly well-known short story mystery kind of writers that did appear in his earlier compilation, or those earlier books of short stories from the late 50s, early 60s. So there's nothing maybe Halloweenish in here except for that whole aura, the aura of mystery, and in my mind, you know, there's that association with Halloween. So this, you know, every year, and I only came across this book about 6 or 7 years ago. This gets pulled out, and I, you know, read a story or two. And this one is my favorite Halloween-oriented fiction book. Another one of short stories. Harvest Tales and Midnight Reveals, stories for the waning of the year. This has a really interesting background, and I'm sorry that they didn't do additional volumes of this. And how this all started, the story of how this all started, was from a guy who was a big fan of Halloween as a kid, and always loved it, but kind of outgrew it as he got older. And one day he was attending a college class, and it happened to be Halloween evening. And he had a fairly late in the day class and was actually walking home from his college class. And was aware of the fact that it was Halloween evening. It was about 7 p.m. And he looked around, and he didn't see anybody trick-or-treating or anything. As he's walking home from his college class. And then he sees one father with 2 small kids, and that was the only person that was doing any kind of trick-or-treating in the few houses that were around. And it struck him at the time how much he liked Halloween and how much he missed celebrating it. And it seemed like the world had almost forgotten about it at that point. And this would have been, I guess, in the early 1980s. So what he sought to do, he wanted to kind of recapture and find something adult to do with the Halloween season, because he thought that, you know, the big problem was that there wasn't a lot of activities for adults to do. So what he did is for a few years he kind of stumbled around looking for something to do with friends, similarly aged friends. And one year, a bunch of friends said they got a bunch of cheap champagne, and they went to an old cemetery, and they just sat around amongst the tombstones drinking this cheap champagne. And then the next year, they found this old, I guess, abandoned, decrepit mansion that I guess no one lived in. They didn't break into it, but they had a party in a courtyard that was attached to the mansion. There was a courtyard there. So they had this Halloween evening party, dancing and things like that, in the courtyard of this old decrepit mansion. And then I guess about on the 3rd or so year of trying to really hit on something that was fun to do, they hit on this idea of having a standard Halloween party at a home, at one of their homes, and everybody invited would bring 2 things. They would bring something to eat, so that there was a whole big feast for everyone of all kinds of food. And everyone that came had to bring some kind of story or poem that had some kind of affiliation with Halloween, whether it had a direct affiliation with Halloween was a big part of the story, or whether it just took place during Halloween, or whether it was a supernatural thing. It didn't matter. It had to have something about Halloween in the context of the story or poem. And it just so happened that most of this guy's friends, he said, were creative people, like writers and musicians anyway. So they had no trouble coming up with these, with this request, and everybody came with some kind of story, and they all read the stories. And it's all explained in the beginning of the book. Great cover too, by the way. And this party went on for at least 10 years that he references in here, because it was just such a great idea, and it is a great idea. And what he did is, he said at the end of about 10 years, he had 80 really great stories. I don't know if this actually has any poems in here, But I know he said he had about 80 really great stories, and all written by his friends. So none of these are old stories that you would have heard before or you would have read before. And he picked 20 of the best ones. Got his friends' permission to print them, and compiled this book of 20 of the best stories from about a 10-year period. And there's some really nice drawings by another one of his friends that accompany some of the stories. There's not a lot of drawings, but there's a handful, and some of them are very, very cool, very much in the Halloween theme. All short stories, naturally, and all original things that you wouldn't have read anywhere else. And I don't know if the book it's available, you can get it, but it is out of print. But the great thing with it, though, is you haven't heard these stories before. They're kind of from a more modern perspective. And it's a shame it wasn't more popular, because there easily could be additional volumes. And I'm fairly sure from anything that I was able to look up on the internet that there weren't any further volumes. Halloween is not just for children, get that? And this originally came out, well, I know this is in hardcover too, so I want to say this edition of it came out in 1998, and I don't know, I'm guessing the hardcover came out before, but probably not a lot before, maybe a year before, so it's not like ancient, late 90s. I love that cover. So I like the whole history and background of this, and maybe someday, who knows, there will be another volume. But that's something that gets pulled out every Halloween season with the intent of reading it. And I usually get through some of it, but again, they're all short stories. And so it's incredible. I have pretty much nothing to show on how long I've gone on, but hey, it's Halloween season. I am going to do a record poll, though. I'm getting back to that. And so let's see what I come up with here. Okay, well, here's the first time that I didn't pull an ECM album. Incredible. Here's, I spoke about him, I think I did a video on him. It's an Anthony Phillips album called Antiques, which would very much appeal to fans of the ECM kind of acoustic classical guitar albums, solo things by Ralph Towner or Bill Connors, or even John Abercrombie's Characters, or even the Windham Hill guys. This is part of a series that Anthony Phillips has done over the year called Private Parts and Pieces. Initially, it was just these little things that he recorded at home, usually very short pieces that weren't made for a specific album, but they were just little pieces he had an idea to do, whether it's guitar or keyboards or whatever instruments, because he plays both. And he just would record them and put them aside, and then he got the opportunity to release an album. Just the initial one was just called Private Parts and Pieces, and it was Volume 1, no subtitle. And he put that out, and then realized he had a lot more other pieces, and it was fairly successful for this kind of music. So over the years, he's kind of jumped back into that, and the Private Parts and Pieces numbers beyond 12 or 13 or 14 now. And the first one was, I want to say, around 1977 or 78. This one is number 3. Came out in 1982, and this one was, I think, a little bit more of a conceptual thing than a bunch of pieces he just had around the house, because all of the music on here, instead of just being these little pieces, sometimes guitar, sometimes keyboards, sometimes heavily overdubbed, sometimes not. This one was the first one of the series that seemed to actually not be so much of just bits and pieces pulled from his home library, but it was a concept because it's guitar duets with Enrique Berrio Garcia, who was a guy I was not familiar with. And these two gentlemen play on all the tracks. There's no additional musicians, and unlike the first two Private Parts and Pieces albums, this was recorded all in one big long series of sessions in June 1981. So it's more of a, he didn't really have to call it Private Parts and Pieces. He could have just stuck with the Antiques title that you see on the top there, because it's not really just one piece recorded here this year and another piece recorded 3 or 4 years later. This is a whole, it says guitar duets, but there is some more extensive overdubbing on it as well. So Anthony Phillips plays classical 12 and 6-string guitars and bass guitar. Enrique Berrio Garcia also plays classical 12-string guitar and a bit of electric guitar. And all recorded in June 1981. So there's not the variety of sound. It's obviously a very guitar-centric album, and not the range of instrumentation that you hear on a lot of the other Private Parts and Pieces albums. Yes, this is very much an album by both of these guys. Most of the tracks were co-written by them, and but nice, pretty album. Nothing experimental or avant-garde about it. This has been re-released on CD a number of times. I only have the original CD release, which just released the 40-something minute album straight. But I believe with the additional CD releases of it that have come out since, there's a whole bunch of additional tracks on there. But pretty album, if you're in the mood to hear a mixture of mostly classical and acoustic guitars, just a little bit of electric here and there. Nice. It's fairly dense because there is a bit of overdubbing on there as well. And hey, the first non-ECM album I've ever picked out of my random vinyl pull. So, March on Halloween. It's officially here now, and I went far too long once again. But thanks for watching, everybody, and it's about 1:30 in the morning now, and I will see you all soon. Take care.
Tales from the Garage is brought to you by Monster Out. Just spray it once a day throughout your home and keeps all monsters away, even invisible ones. Say goodbye to ghoulies, goblins, gremlins, mummies, vampires, and the living dead. Not effective on witches, chicken men, or rhino girls. And by Smoky brand cigarettes. 9 out of 10 doctors recommend smoky cigarettes to their patients. Remember, gals love a smoky man. Smoky, the key to great taste. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.